You will think, what if I told you that a single whisper of deception could decide the fate of 80,000 men? Picture a sun-bleached plain stretching endlessly beneath the steppe sky. Dust clings to armor, banners flutter in the wind, and the heavy rumble of hooves rolls like distant thunder. It is 1223, and the mighty princes of Rus, allied with their Cuman brethren, march confidently toward a victory they believe is theirs. Yet, in the unseen shadows of this vast land, the Mongols, masters of cunning and silent death, have already written a different ending for them. Welcome to Whispering Myths, where the dust-covered pages of history come alive. Mongol horsemen once thundered across continents, their ruthless tactics erasing enemies before they even realized it. Join us as we uncover the secrets of the empire that changed human history. Far ahead of the allied host, two Mongol generals, Subutai and Jebe, ride with the calmness of hunters. For weeks, they have allowed themselves to appear weak. Stragglers in retreat, men barely holding their lines against the swelling tide of Rus warriors. Every skirmish has been deliberate, every feigned loss a carefully laid breadcrumb on a trail leading straight into the jaws of annihilation. The princes believe they are chasing victory. In truth, they are chasing ghosts. The Mongols understood something their enemies did not. Fear is louder than any war drum. At night, they left behind dying horses, abandoned wagons, and even scattered gold to lure the allied army further. Scouts whispered to each other that the Mongols were exhausted, fractured, and desperate to escape. It was a lie wrapped in the ragged clothing of truth, and it worked flawlessly. As the allied forces thundered deeper into the steppe, discipline frays, supplies dwindle, horses tire, but pride blinds them. 80,000 strong, they believe no force can stand against their might. They do not see that the land itself is turning against them, rivers crossing their path, open plains offering no cover, where their enemies vanishing only to reappear miles away like spirits riding the wind. In this endless game of retreat and pursuit, Subutai and Jebe are not fleeing. They are tightening an invisible noose, every step drawing the allied army farther from safety, deeper into isolation, and closer to a trap so complete it will be remembered for centuries. The days dragged on, and the great allied host became a serpent stretching miles across the barren land. Dust clouded the air, and heat hammered down on steel helmets, baking flesh beneath layers of chainmail. Still, the princes pressed forward, convinced that the Mongols were finally breaking. Every abandoned campsite told them the same story: enemy desperation, enemy fear. But fear was not theirs to claim. It belonged to those who marched unknowingly into the web. Subutai and Jebe moved like phantoms, never allowing their pursuers to close the distance. At dawn, Mongol riders would appear on the horizon, loosing arrows that struck with uncanny precision before melting into the vast expanse. By nightfall, fires would flicker in the distance, only to vanish when the allies gave chase. What the princes did not see was the silent communication, the invisible coordination that made the Mongol retreat so perfect. Messengers darted like hawks between hidden detachments. Scouts tracked every movement of the Rus and Cuman forces, predicting their decisions as though reading from a script. Subutai's mind was not on survival, it was on positioning. Every false retreat, every staged defeat was a calculated stroke on the canvas of war, painting the battlefield that would soon devour 80,000 souls. The Allied commanders argued in their tents. Some questioned why the Mongols never stood to fight. Others insisted victory was near, that pressing forward would crush the enemy completely. In the flickering torchlight, pride drowned out caution. Not one prince considered that the endless chase itself might be the weapon. Weeks passed, and food became scarce. Horses stumbled, men muttered curses under their breath. Yet, the belief in imminent triumph kept them marching. The steppe seemed endless, each sunrise revealing only more flat horizon and fleeting Mongol silhouettes. What no one realized was that the farther they advanced, the farther they drifted from their supply lines and reinforcements. And then on the edge of the Kalka River, the hunt would end, not with the Allies striking the killing blow, but with the jaws of the Mongol trap slamming shut, faster and deadlier than any army had seen before. The Kalka River glimmered under the summer sun, its waters deceptively calm. When the Allied army finally reached its banks, exhaustion weighed on every soldier like an iron yoke. Dust-caked faces turned toward the horizon, where, at last, Mongol banners fluttered in the open. The sight sent a surge of triumph through the princes' ranks. After weeks of relentless pursuit, they believed the fleeing enemy had nowhere left to run. But Subutai and Jebe had orchestrated this moment with surgical precision. They knew their pursuers' spirits were frayed, their formations stretched thin, and discipline shattered by arrogance and fatigue. Now, the Mongols revealed themselves not as prey, but as predators ready to strike. The first clash came swiftly. A detachment of Mongol cavalry rode forward, seemingly desperate, firing arrows in a scattered retreat. The Allied forces, hungry for the final blow, charged with reckless abandon. Dust billowed as thousands of hooves pounded the dry earth. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the Mongols wheeled away, their retreat even more frantic than before. To the princes, this was proof. The enemy was collapsing. But unseen behind ridges and in narrow folds of land, hidden Mongol forces waited. Subutai had spent weeks mapping the terrain, knowing every rise and hollow. He had positioned reserves like coiled vipers, silent and unseen. The false retreat pulled the Allies straight into this killing ground, stretching their massive army into fractured, disorganized columns. When the trap finally sprung, it did so with the ferocity of a thunderstorm. Mongol horns blared across the plains. From both flanks, cavalry erupted like shadows made flesh, cutting into exposed sides of the Rus and Kuman formations. Arrows darkened the sky, raining death with unerring accuracy. Horses screamed, men fell in droves, and chaos devoured order within moments. The princes, realizing too late that they had been lured, tried desperately to rally their troops. But the Mongols had already shattered their unity. Small groups were isolated and overwhelmed, surrounded by swirling riders who struck and vanished before counterattacks could land. Panic spread like wildfire, and the riverbanks became a slaughterhouse. This was no mere battle. It was an execution delivered with the elegance of a master strategist. Subutai had turned their pride into their undoing, and now every decision the Allied leaders had made fed the machine of their own destruction. The slaughter along the Kalka River unfolded with merciless precision. The Allied army, once a roaring tide of 80,000 warriors, now fractured into desperate pockets of resistance. The Mongols encircled each group like wolves isolating wounded prey, striking with speed and coordination that the Rus and Kumans had never witnessed. Every Mongol rider seemed to carry not just a bow and sword, but an invisible tether to Subutai's mind. Signals, subtle horn blasts, raised banners, a flash of light from a mirrored disc, moved across the battlefield faster than thought itself. At a single command, archers loosed volleys that blotted out the sun, arrows whistling like a storm of angry spirits. When melee was unavoidable, Mongol lances pierced through armor as if it were cloth, each strike a deliberate stroke in a dance of death. Allied commanders attempted to regroup, shouting orders drowned by the chaos. Some tried to form defensive circles. Others fled toward the riverbanks. But even retreat had been anticipated. Mongol riders swept around like a tide, cutting off escape routes and driving terrified soldiers straight into waiting traps. Horses stumbled into marshy ground where hidden ambushers struck without mercy. Among the Mongols, there was no frenzy, no clumsy bloodlust, only cold, disciplined execution. Every maneuver was designed to dismantle the enemy's will. Even psychological warfare had its place. Mongols dragged captured soldiers before the eyes of their comrades, executed them swiftly, and hurled their bodies back into the fray, breaking morale with horrifying efficiency. The princes of Rus, realizing they could not break free, made a desperate bid for survival. They formed a fortified camp with wagons and barricades, hoping to hold out until nightfall. Perhaps reinforcements could come. Perhaps the Mongols would finally falter. But Subutai was a master not only of battle, but of patience. He knew that crushing his enemies was not enough. He had to make an example so devastating that no force would dare challenge Mongol supremacy again. Thus, as the sun dipped low, he ordered the next phase of the deception, a siege unlike any the princes had ever imagined, one that would turn their last hope into the final act of their undoing. Night cloaked the battlefield, but fear burned brighter than any campfire within the Allied barricades. Surrounded and bloodied, the Rus princes clung to a fragile hope. They believed the Mongols might attempt a direct assault and fail against their improvised defenses. Yet Subutai had no intention of wasting men on brute force. His mind worked in layers of deception, each more ruthless than the last. At dawn, Mongol envoys rode up to the barricades carrying white banners, symbols of peace. They spoke in calm, measured tones, offering safe passage to the princes and their surviving warriors if they surrendered. Exhausted and facing starvation, the Allied leaders deliberated. Many distrusted the offer, yet desperation gnawed at their courage. If there was a chance to save at least some of their men, could they refuse? One by one, the princes agreed to the terms. Gates were opened, weapons lowered, and captives filed out under the watchful eyes of Mongol riders. Relief washed over the camp. They thought the nightmare was ending. But the promise of safety was only another layer of Subutai's trap. The Mongols disarmed their captives and divided them into groups. Some were bound, others made to sit under the scorching sun without water. Hours turned into days as Mongols slowly, methodically executed prisoners in small numbers. Never enough to spark rebellion, always enough to crush hope. Then came the fate of the highest-ranking princes. Subutai ordered that they be laid beneath wooden planks, and Mongol generals feasted atop them, their banquets turning noble blood into a living carpet beneath their boots. Not a single sword was drawn in protest. The terror was absolute, the humiliation beyond comprehension. When the killings ended, nearly every man from the Allied army lay dead, strangled by deception more than steel. What had begun as a confident march to victory ended as a massacre, so complete that the lands of Rus would tremble at the name Mongol for generations. Far from the Kalka River, Subutai and Jebe rode silently, their mission accomplished. They had shown the world a new kind of warfare, one where battles were won long before the first arrow flew, where an enemy's pride and trust could be turned into the sharpest blades. As the Mongol columns vanished into the horizon, the aftermath of the Kalka River massacre spread like a shadow across Eastern Europe. Smoke still curled from abandoned camps, crows circled overhead, and the stench of death clung to the summer air. Few survivors limped back to tell the tale. When they did, their words sounded less like war stories and more like the whisper of some inescapable nightmare. The princes who had dreamed of glory now existed only as warnings. Their armies, once mighty enough to shake kingdoms, were nothing but scattered bones along the riverbanks. The Mongols had achieved something unprecedented, not merely defeating a larger force, but erasing its will to resist. This was more than victory. It was transformation. A brutal revelation that the old ways of war, head-on charges, rigid honor codes, reliance on sheer numbers, were relics doomed to fail against minds like Subutai's. But the genius of the Mongol deception reached even further. The slaughter at Kalka was not an isolated event. It was a message carried by terrified refugees into every court and stronghold across Rus and beyond. Lords and kings whispered of an enemy who never fought fair, who vanished like mist only to return as a storm, who used fear as a weapon sharper than any blade. While other commanders saw battlefields as stages for bravery, Subutai saw them as chessboards. He understood that armies could be broken long before swords crossed, that victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the unseen hand guiding every move, every false retreat, every carefully planted rumor. Even as he and Jebe rode back toward the Mongol heartlands, plans for future campaigns already bloomed in his mind. The Kalka River was merely one act in a grand symphony of conquest. In time, this same mastery of deception would topple cities thought impregnable, crush empires that had stood for centuries, and redraw the map of the known world. And yet, beneath the bloodshed and terror, there was a lesson carved deep into history's bones, that wars are not truly won on fields of carnage, but in the minds of men, long before they ever know they've lost. The echoes of battle still whisper across the steppes. Don't let these ancient tales fade into silence. Subscribe, like, and join us as we unveil the secrets of history's most fearsome warriors.